Hello everybody, thank you so much for joining our 5th APWF webinar. My name is Yumiko Asayama, the manager of Japan Water Forum and also taking care of the APWF as a secretariat. Today, we welcome Dr. Tom Panella, Chief Water Sector Group, Asian Development Bank, and Dr. Xavier Leflaive. He is leader of Resilience, Adaptation, and Water Team of Environmental Directorate of OECD. Asian Water Development Outlook 2020 was released in 18th December, last Friday. This is the ADB's flagship document developed by its partner organization and also APWF. Today, Dr. Panella and also Dr. Xavier introduce the overview of the outcomes of the AWDO 2020. Then we will specifically focus on the discussion about the financing water security and SDG in Asia and the Pacific. Before we start today's webinar, I would like to introduce today's technical operation of this webinar. Firstly, Dr. Panella and Dr. Xavier will make presentation. Followed by that, Mr. Ravinarayanan, our Governing Council Chair of the APWF, briefly facilitate today's discussion, starting from his question. Followed by some brief discussion among them, we will ask every audience to raise hand to ask question to our panelists today. So you will see the raise button hand in the bottom of your computer. Then please click on that. Then our technical staff will find you. Then we will call you. So once we call you, we appointed your name. Please unmute your mic. Then ask question to our panelist. Thank you so much for your cooperation. And if you have any question, comment, feedback, please add it to the Q&A box or chat box. Thank you so much for your technical cooperation for our technical operation. Now, I would like to call to our Governing Council Chair, Mr. Ravinarayanan, to deliver opening remarks of today's webinar. Ravi, thank you so much for your cooperation for today's webinar.
Thank you very much, and a good morning and good afternoon to everybody, and a very warm welcome to the 5th series of webinars in the lead up to the 4th Asia Pacific Water Summit, about which I'll talk a little more at the end of the webinar. So today we've got a very important session. We're talking about the Asian Water Development Outlook 2020 and financing water security and the SDGs in the Asia and the Pacific. The Asian Water Development Outlook is a pioneering effort by the Asian Development Bank to develop an index of countries, country by country, all 49 countries in the region, to assess the state of security of their water systems and practices, and to make recommendations for the future in order to improve it. We have two very distinguished speakers today, Tom Panella, Chief of the Water Sector Group of the Asian Development Bank, and Dr. Xavier Leflaive, Team Leader, Resilience, Water Environment Directorate of the OECD, to introduce the subject, followed by a brief Q&A session. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Tom Panella to kick off the proceedings and start on the AWDO 2020. Tom.
Thanks, Ravi. Thank you, Ravi. And as Yumiko-san said, we launched AWDO last Friday, and very pleased to basically give you the same presentation in an abbreviated form, but then have Xavier go much more in depth on the financing. And as we go through today, I think we'd like to focus the discussion and your questions on financing. So be prepared to raise those issues at the end of the seminar, and we'd be happy to respond and engage you, and particularly about financing and the SDGs. So let me share my screen here. And okay, can you confirm that it's sharing?
Confirmed.
Okay, great. So let's talk a little bit about Asian Water Development Outlook. This is the fourth in a series starting in 2007 that focuses on water security. And it's a communication tool, but also importantly, it's to guide policy reforms. And as I'll touch on briefly, it's been doing that more and more with actual applications at the national and subnational level. Importantly though, AWDO is a product of partners. My colleague and good friend Xavier is here as testament to that OECD for the first time produced chapters on finance and governance, but we've been working closely with International Water Management Institute, International Water Center, Korean Institute of Civil Engineering and Building Technology, all contributed to the fourth edition with generous support from Government of Australia. So the fourth edition of AWDO uses the same key dimension methodology in the last two editions that allows us also to track progress across time against these dimensions. They've been updated and reflect newer methodologies, and we'll go into that in a little bit later. But the definition we use is the availability of an adequate quantity and quality of water to ensure safe, affordable, equitable, and inclusive water supply and sanitation, together with sustainable livelihoods and healthy ecosystems and manageable water-related risks. Operationalizing water security will help foster resilient rural and urban economies in Asia and the Pacific. Very similar to other definitions, and we'll go through it in a bit more detail now. The main output from AWDO over the last three editions has been the National Water Index for Security. And what we have here is a map of the countries covered in AWDO. And what we have is a ranking from 1 to 5, 1 being nascent and 5 being model. And this is a composite of those 5 different dimensions of water security that you saw. And what we find across developing Asia is most of the countries fall into either category 2 or 3, engaged or capable. We have a limited number of countries in effective, or 4, and that's the developed economies in Asia Pacific, and only 1 country is nascent. And while we have many incapable, we have many that are engaged, which is substandard or shows room for improvement with water security. So the story has been over the last 3 editions that basically we see a positive trend. Several ADB members have improved from nascent to engaged, most notably the People's Republic of China and India. And while that's only 2 countries, that's a significant number of people, nearly half the population of Asia and the Pacific. But as noted, we still have many people living in the nascent or engaged stages. So there is much more work to be done. As the next slide indicates, this is a ranking based on all the scores, and here you can see the different dimensions, rural, economic, urban, that are summed together to provide that composite ranking. And on the last slide, we have the website, so you can download the AWDO report free and look at this in more detail. Let's go through the key dimensions quickly here. So we have key dimension 1, which is rural water security. And in this edition, rural is broken out, so there's no double counting. And rural is water security is the assessed to the extent of which ADB members provide safe, sufficient, safe, physically accessible and affordable water and sanitation services for health and livelihoods, coupled with an acceptable level of water-related risk in rural households. Now, it's interesting to note that this is by far the smallest volume of water we're talking about in all the key dimensions, yet over half the households in Asia and the Pacific are rural. So while it's a small amount of water, it's a very vital, important water for the well-being of many of the people across Asia and the Pacific. And some of the key findings and results are the Maldives has made significant progress since 2013 with an increase in access. And I think something that's important to note with this is, well, some countries, their scores have remained low, such as India, Nepal, and Cambodia. They've had significant improvements with access to sanitation in particular. And it's also worth noting that some of the data sets we're using are JMP, or the UN monitoring data for SDGs. So some of those data sets may be 2018. So the scores may not fully capture all the improvements that have been made. And certainly the next data will fully capture all of those scores, but using the publicly accessible and certified data sets, that's the environment we have to live with. And what are the policy recommendations? I think the important thing is you need a holistic approach to make progress here. You can't just focus on infrastructure or the policy and environment, and that capacity is incredibly important to make sure that you can get implementation of the programs to affect change, and that locally appropriate solutions are needed, particularly in the Pacific. The next key dimension is economic water security. And the definition is the assurance of adequate water to sustainably satisfy a country's economic growth and accommodate economic losses due to water-induced disasters. And this is a broad definition, including agriculture, energy, and industry. And by far, this is the largest volume of water that we're talking about. And its physical water scarcity does not necessarily indicate economic constraints, which is included in the indicator. And it's also important that water must be delivered reliably in time, space, and quality to assure economic water security. Some of the key results our changes to economic water security take years of planning and policy prioritization to achieve. Now, this is not surprising to the water community, and it's not just for this dimension, but that's true for all dimensions of water security. It just doesn't happen overnight, and it does require a focused, conscious effort by policymakers and planners. And where we've seen tremendous progress is in East Asia, mainly due to the results of People's Republic of China, with a large focus on food and water security. And even despite progress in all regions, we've seen some regression due to water stress across the region, and the greatest challenges in the Pacific Islands. Policy recommendations: improved data monitoring and measurement, and also related to one of the SDGs, we need to apply integrated water resources management to achieve the outcomes we'd like to see, and assure adequate storage and distribution systems that can mitigate and adapt to climate change and improve sectoral reallocation. The third key dimension is urban water security. That is the extent to which countries are providing safely managed and affordable water and sanitation services to their urban communities to achieve the desired outcomes. And this, again, is access to water supply, sanitation, and affordability, but also includes a drainage and environmental component. Some of the key findings is that we have many countries that are still nascent. And again, it's the Pacific that is most challenged. And we still have 18 member countries, or nearly 800 million people that are in the engaged level. So it is quite a few people where more needs to be done. And I think the other not surprising finding is there has been significant investment, but due to the rapid population and urbanization growth in Asia, it's very difficult to keep pace with meeting the needs of the urban growth with the investments and policy changes. So what are the recommendations is pay more attention to urban growth, non-revenue water consumption, energy use, climate change, improved management of data and information, and we need to quantify future security risks in addition to current security. This is something we've looked at not just in urban, but across AWDO, and something that probably will be going into more detail on the next drafts of AWDO. Is what is the future situation, because it's currently more a static snapshot than a future looking document. Key dimension 4 is environmental water security, which is environmental water security assesses the health of rivers, wetlands, and groundwater systems, and measures the progress on restoring aquatic ecosystems and catchments to health on a national and regional scale. So basically you have 2 dimensions, or 2 sub-indicators. One is environmental governance, policies and regulations, and then the ecosystems themselves. Some of the key findings are South Asia scored not as well as the other sub-regions on both metrics in this area. And the other thing is, I think that's not reflected here, is most of the improvement that we saw here was due to the improvement in environmental governance, not to the restoration or rehabilitation of aquatic ecosystems or catchments. So what this suggests too is that there's a risk to future water security. So the recommendations are, we do need to put paramount emphasis on healthy functioning aquatic ecosystems, because they are the foundation for water security. Having safe, secure sources of fresh water are needed if we're to maintain the other 4 dimensions of water security, and then putting some key principles in place to ensure that we have high quality ecosystems. 5th key dimension is water related disaster, water security. And this was significantly, I'd say, enhanced with this version of AWDO, where in the previous versions, we only looked at the capacity of a country for resilience, not the risk factor. And in this version, we've looked at both the exposure and risk, as well as the country's ability to respond and bounce back. So here we have basically the definition: assess a nation's recent exposure to water-related disaster and their vulnerability to those disasters and capacity to resist and bounce back. And what we're talking about is drought, flooding, and storms. I think the overall findings are somewhat positive, that we see decreasing vulnerability to risk against for the region and an increasing capacity to deal with risks. And again, we see the greatest risks in the Pacific and the small island states. Recommendations: enhance international efforts to standardize data, collection of disaster impacts, in particular gender disaggregated data. I think one of the most striking findings here is there's a significant disparate impact of water-related disasters on women and girls, and that we really need to have a proactive approach to gender response to water-related disaster, as well as to preparedness for water-related disaster, taking into account the needs for women and girls. And we need to promote new financing mechanisms for risk mitigation, including both green and gray infrastructure. So let me just talk briefly about water governance. We use the OECD's 12 principles on water governance, and for those of you familiar with the water governance initiative of the OECD, you should be familiar with this. If you're not familiar with it, I would encourage you to look online and get involved with the Water Governance Initiative. It's an excellent program and dialogue and platform to discuss really fascinating and important issues related to water. And so it's very easy to find just looking at the OECD website. So what are some of the key things that we see in and this is basically just looking what's on the books. The roles and responsibilities are quite well defined. And the scales are quite well defined in terms of effectiveness across all the countries. But when you get down to monitoring and evaluation, dealing with trade-offs, stakeholder engagement, and integrity, and even with integrity, we find that it's not in place or in place just in the developing economies. So, and we also find quite often there's not sufficient data in place, including for data and information. And I think this was a pervasive finding across everything we did in AWDO, and something that we need to look at is there's just not enough data out there to have the type of analysis that we'd really like to have to make the changes for water security, and I'm sure Xavier is well aware of this with his finance work. So lastly, what are the recommendations here? Strengthening and implementation monitoring of water-related policies, and adopting the policy instruments to manage trade-offs. This is particularly important with the environment. We cannot let the environment suffer as a consequence of meeting the other 4 water security dimensions. Using economic instruments more effectively across the region for good management, as well as generating revenue, and increasing stakeholder engagement, and mainstreaming integrity and transparency across water policies. Now the presentation will be available online. I assume if you can get it from ADB or APWF. We didn't do the case studies, so I will go through those. And I just want to go to the end to give you, oops, anyway, there is the website, as well as our ADB website, or you can just email me or Yumiko and we can give you more information on that. And I'll close there. And let me pull up Xavier's presentation and turn the floor over to him. So I believe you can see the presentation.
I can. Thank you very much, Tom. And congratulations for such a clear presentation that covers a lot of ground in a very short time. So well done. And I realize you could just as well present the, the section on finance, but I'm happy to help. Good afternoon or good evening to all of you. This is still dark in the morning in Paris, but it's really a privilege happy to share with you the main messages that derive from our cooperation with ADB on financing for water supply, for water security in Asia and the Pacific. Next slide, please. So I work at the OECD in the Environment Directorate, where I coordinate a team that works on water resilience and adaptation to climate change. We've done quite some work on financing water in the context of a regional meeting of the Roundtable on Financing Water, which was actually co-convened with ADB about a year ago in Manila. So in addition to the data that we collected through the process of AWDO, the report also builds on the discussions which took place in Manila last year. The third thing I would like to flag here is that we really try to measure financing flows for water security, but also look ahead, look forward, and try to project financing needs and assess financing capacities. When you look forward or look ahead, you have to set yourself an objective or a target or reference in terms of water security. And here, for lack of a better or more specific ambition, we considered SDGs, and in particular SDG 6, as the level of ambition for water management, water security in Asia and the Pacific. One challenge we faced, obviously, is the lack of harmonized data across the 49 countries. So maybe a first message to you here is that there may be an opportunity to provide or to work at sub-regional level and try to harmonize data when it comes to measuring efforts, financing resources committed to contribute to water security. We've done a similar exercise in Europe, so it's obviously a smaller and probably more or less diverse region, if you like. But one distinctive feature of Europe is that they put a lot of effort into harmonizing data collection, and that's very useful to benchmark the performance of countries, to compare how well some countries are doing vis-a-vis others. And that's very telling both for governments, but also for investors who can spot investing opportunities across the region and a variety of stakeholders. So that's that may be a room for improvement. Organizations like the Asia Pacific Water Forum and some other partners, including ADB, may have an interest in supporting that kind of effort. Next slide, please. So the Tom, can you move to the next slide, please?
I'm trying.
Okay, sorry.
One second, Xavier.
The next slide explains the three domains where we have focused our attention. Does it help if I share my screen?
Now let me.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the next slide characterizes the three domains where we have tried to project investment needs. So the first one is water supply and sanitation. The second one is flood protection, and the third one is irrigation. Water supply and sanitation is actually the only domain or subsector where we were able to monetize investment needs for the region. And I think there are interesting messages that derive from that work. Essentially, that most countries will need to allocate between 1 to 2% of their GDP to invest in water supply and sanitation between now and 2030, which can be quite demanding, and come back to that in a minute. There will be outliers, typically countries which are lagging behind from that perspective, and which would need to catch up. Then the question is, how much countries have the capacity to meet these needs? I'll come back to that The second domain is flood protection, and across the world, and in particular in Asia and the Pacific, it's very difficult to monetize how much countries spend on flood protection. Very few countries actually have robust data in that domain, which is an issue because then it's difficult to assess whether money is being spent effectively and whether flood protection measures are cost effective and appropriate. So we use a proxy, which is exposure to flood risks. And here you see that several countries in the region will be exposed to, will have a significant part of their GDP exposed to flood risks. That obviously contributes to making a strong economic case for investment in flood protection. And of course, considering economic development, which increases the value of assets at risks of flooding, considering population growth, which again increases exposure, but also drivers such as climate change. You can anticipate that the need to invest in flood protection can only increase across the region, with a few exceptions. Irrigation is another area where we try to focus our attention. Again, very difficult to characterize current financing flows and future needs for irrigation. The point here is that most countries will need to combine both expansion of irrigated area, but also enhancements of efficiency in irrigation systems to meet their goals in terms of food security. Typically, and these, I mean, the drivers are well known. You will find in the report some data on investment needs for irrigation at sub-regional level. It's very difficult to have robust data at national level, so we use existing databases at sub-regional level, which are quite telling. Next slide, please. On the next slide, I'll zoom here on projected investment needs for water supply and sanitation. And as I said, you'll see that most countries in the region will have to invest between 1% and 2% of their GDP in this sector in the next 10 to 15 years. That can represent significant level of expenditure per capita. So typically countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, or Myanmar, but Bangladesh and Philippines are in the same category, will have to invest up to $350 per person in that domain, and that can be quite a significant amount of money. Next slide, please. So we now turn to analyzing the financing capacities across the region. And on that slide, you see where the main sources of finance, what the main sources of finance can be. So for water supply and sanitation, we focus on tariffs, so revenues from prices on the water supply and sanitation services, taxes, so typically public budget, and transfers from the international community that can come from official development assistance or other concessional funds. For water security at large, there are more diverse sources of finance. So you still have development finance and public budgets, but a more diverse set of beneficiaries who can contribute to financing investment in flood protection, for instance, or to investment to enhance water quality. As a separate category, you can see repayable finance, such as concessional finance or commercial finance. The key here is that the repayable finance, as the name says, has to be paid back. And it will have to be repaid by a combination of tariff, taxes, and transfers. So repayable finance cannot come as an additional source of finance. It can bridge a short-term financing need, but ultimately the money will have to come from a combination of tariff, taxes, and transfers. Next slide, please. So in the book, we try to analyze the state of play vis-à-vis the three ultimate sources of finance. And obviously, public taxes remain the main source of finance for water-related infrastructure across the region. This is not atypical, but this is an issue in a context where you know, in a post-COVID environment, public finance will be scarce, competition to access it will be fierce, and reliance on taxes may lead to a postponement of some of the needed investment. Official development assistance has a role to play. However, in absolute terms, it remains small compared to other sources of finance and to financing needs. So ODA will only deliver when it's properly leveraged. And there is a number of opportunities to be captured there. One point about ODA that it may not be targeting those countries or those communities which most need it. So maybe food for thought for some of our partners in the region. Finally, tariffs. So typically in the context of water supply and sanitation services, tariffs are underutilized. We acknowledge that affordability can be a barrier in selected countries. However, in most countries, tariffs could be higher and affordability issues would be better addressed through targeted social measures typically than through cheap water. I want to reiterate that point, which has been made over and over, but that seems difficult to convey, is that cheap water hurts poor communities because it deprives the utilities from the revenues it needs to improve the service, extend coverage, and benefit people who are not served at the moment. Next slide, please. On the next chart, you see an attempt to characterize the financing strategies for water supply and sanitation services in selected countries, combining different sources of information. And here you see that some countries have really tried to enhance the share of revenues from tariffs in financing for water supply and sanitation. This is typically the case in the Maldives, but also countries like Philippines, while other countries very significantly rely on public finance. This is obviously the case for Mongolia, but also People's Republic of China or Vietnam. Again, this can be an issue depending on the situation of the country. This can be an issue particularly in a post-COVID environment where competition to access finance would be severe. Next slide, please. That chart compares ODA flows that are tagged for water-related infrastructure in the region. I won't comment into the detail for lack of time, but this is very accurate data which can be used to measure the level of effort and identify the main beneficiaries from ODA. And this is where you can see that there may be a disconnect between where money goes, where development money goes, and the countries which most need it. My final slides will focus on the policy recommendations that can be derived from the analysis in the report. And here there is really a message I would like to hammer down quite clearly, that financing water security in Asia and the Pacific is not just about more money. Our message here is that, of course, more money will be needed, but still, most countries could do better with the existing financing flows. It was clear from a presentation in several KDs mentioned by Tom that there is already quite a lot of money going into typically urban water infrastructure and other elements of water security. So how to make the best use of the money that is already available in the sector? Well, first point is to make the best use of available assets, typically through enhancing the operational efficiency of service providers. And here we see a role for independent economic regulation, which can help to monitor the performance of service providers, benchmark that performance, and provide incentives for enhanced efficiency. Second pillar here of a robust financing strategy is to avoid building future liabilities. We see too many investments in other domains, typically for urban water, urban development, agriculture, or energy supply, which will drive additional needs for investment in water security, because they will put more assets at risks or more water resources at risk. So here, typically, it can be cost effective to, for instance, to manage water demand and strengthen water resources allocation instead of augmenting supply. It can be cost effective to consider flood risk mitigation strategies, which build upon ecosystems, nature-based solutions, and other technologies that are typically discussed in KD4, instead of relying on large dams, reservoirs, or dikes. Typically, encouraging policy coherence across water and other domains such as energy, agriculture, and urban development is critical from that perspective. The third pillar of a well-developed financing strategy for water security is to improve tools to plan and decide on investments, and to also improve financing mechanisms in place. The point here is not to develop more plans, but it's to make sure that the plans which exist are future-proof, that the plans properly factor in climate change, but also that these plans will actually drive decisions. And again, they have to drive decisions in a number of domains, policy domains, not only on water per se, but also it's critical that these plans are supported by realistic financing strategies. We see too many plans which are actually paper tigers because they will not be implemented because of lack of capacities and lack of finance. So here again, room for improvement. And obviously, there will be a need to harness additional sources of finance. Here we can simply flag two areas. First, ensure that tariffs for water supply and sanitation services reflect the cost of service provision. And again, there will be more effective measures to address affordability issues, for instance, through targeted social measures than through cheap water. There are options to consider new sources of finance. I mentioned them in the previous slide. Think about property developers who benefit from enhanced water security. It would be fair that they contribute to footing the bill of water security. And you can think of fiscal instruments such as land value capture or land value taxes to capture to harness that source of finance. And obviously a role again for ODA, official development assistance, and public finance to crowd in other sources of finance. And here we think about domestic commercial finance through combination that can contribute to de-risking some specific investments and make them palatable for commercial financiers. I'll stop there. Obviously, AWDO provides a lot more information and detailed analysis and policy recommendations. So I really recommend that you read through the report, a fantastic achievement coordinated by ADB. We are very proud to be part of that. This is not the end of the story. We would be very delighted to continue to work with countries in the regions in partnership with ADB, with the Asia Water Forum, Asia Pacific Water Forum, and other stakeholders if there is an appetite for that. Thank you very much for your attention. Ravi, I think you will take the floor now.
Thank you very much, Xavier. Now we have not much time for a question and answer session, but don't despair. If you run out of time, you can always send your questions to Yumiko at Asia Pacific Water Forum, and she will forward it to Tom and Xavier, and you'll get a reply later on. But let me start this session by asking both Tom and Xavier a couple of questions. Tom, to you, in the discourses and debates and discussions on water security in general, we have a lot of emphasis on KD1, KD3, and KD5. That is urban water security, rural water security, and disasters. But not so much on economic water security, irrigation, energy, and industry, and not so much on environmental water security. Should and can the AWDO help to bridge this gap? That's to you, Tom. And to Xavier later on. Xavier, you know, when you talk about your financing recommendations, is there a connect between the recommendations for good governance and good finance? So those are the two questions I start off with. So Tom, you first.
Thanks, Ravi. Well, let's look at the question a little bit. I mean, I think what you're asking is not too surprising, because when we look at KD2, and to a certain extent KD4, KD2, you're looking at water as an input to something that we as people enjoy as an output, which isn't directly water. KD1, you're directly interacting with the water. KD3, you're directly interacting, and KD5, unfortunately, you're interacting with the water or the lack of water. So I think, you know, KD2 starts reaching prominence when certain consumer goods aren't available, but we've constructed a market that responds just by bringing in goods from some other place where there is water. I think what we have to do is, yes, use water security as a way to raise that discussion around economic water security. And it is a very complex discussion, because then you're also talking about intersectoral allocation of water between agriculture, energy, these types of things, and people's livelihoods, jobs. All of these are dependent on this. So AWDO can help raise that discussion and inform that discussion. And I think that is a very important discussion to have, because if you start in economic water security, if you're starting from a reactive position, you're in a very bad situation at that point. So we really need to use AWDO and everything we can to raise awareness and start planning for dealing with economic water security and intersectoral reallocation. Climate change will drive this significantly. So yes, AWDO needs to do this and will do this. Environmental water security, I think I stressed throughout my talk. We do need AWDO to raise the awareness there. That is fundamental to everything we do. If we lose resilient and intact aquatic ecosystems and catchments, then much of what we do for all other water security will be in vain. I'll stop there and turn it over to Xavier.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Ravi, for a very relevant questions. I can think actually, I mean, the relationship between finance and governance actually goes both ways. If you think about it, you need some financing resources to for good governance. Good governance relies on the institutions. And typically, you know, my experience, for instance, in Central Asia, is that institutions that contribute to good water management need to be properly funded at national level, at basin level, at local level. You need, and it doesn't need to be a huge amount of money compared to the volume of money that goes into investment, but you need to have the proper staff. You need to have some equipment, you know, to monitor water flows, to monitor water quality. So these institutions need a secure level of funding to be able to operate. But of course, the connection between finance and governance also goes in the other direction, and strong governance can contribute to robust finance. As Tom said in the presentation, governance contributes to efficiency, effectiveness, and trust. And these are three conditions to secure robust and stable financing flows for water security. Think about trust. If you don't have strong stakeholder engagement to improve, or to make sure that investment decisions are robust, that they will be implemented, if you don't have that level of trust in water policies and investment decisions, it will be very difficult to secure stable financing flows, especially if you want to explore opportunities to work with commercial finance. So indeed, a strong connection between finance and governance in both directions.
Thank you, Xavier. Now, we don't have time for many more questions. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
We don't have time for many more questions, perhaps a couple, and then the other questions can be sent in writing. So Yumiko, can you help me in sort of fielding the questions in the chat box?
Yes.
Or from the Q&A?
Yes, wait a minute. So can I ask from Myanmar, Mr. Kyo Mo-u, to raise hand and ask question to our panelist? Anyway, I will call. He is asking how to make improving water security and can be supporting technical assistance to enhance water security in Asia Pacific. So Tom or Xavier, can you ask? Yes. Sorry.
I guess it depends on what is. We've gone through the different dimensions of water security, and as Xavier's presentation has made clear, there's different aspects. So I guess what we'd need would be a bit more specificity on what aspect of financing water security you would be interested in for Myanmar, and then could help define some terms of reference of what you would be interested in looking at. And if you could send a bit more detailed question about what you're interested in, we could respond with greater detail to meet your needs. Over.
And if I may elaborate on Tom's point, which is very valid, but it's very difficult to have concrete recommendations when you cover a region which is so diverse, and that includes 49 countries. So obviously, as we said, we'd be very happy to have a more specific discussion at either sub-regional or maybe even at national level. That's where you can really be more specific about appropriate and robust financing strategies for water security, tailoring the recommendation to the key risks. The KDs, as Tom said, the KDs which are particularly at risk in the country, but also tailoring the recommendations to capacities. So it would be difficult to have a more blanket or generic response. Over.
Thank you. Can I ask two more questions? One is from Mr. Narayan Joshi. Can you ask a question to our panelist? Okay, now I will skip. So ask question by email, Mr. Narayan. And now I would like to ask your home away take-away message to audience to enhance financing water security in Asia at the current scenario. Tom and Xavier, please deliver your take-away message from today's webinar. Thank you.
Well, as we just said, it's difficult to have you know, a particular recommendation that covers that would be relevant at the regional level. We would need to have more specific discussion at the disaggregated level. If there is one key message I would like to emphasize again is that more could be done with current financing flows. So typically focusing on the effectiveness of expenditure programs and the capacity of these expenditure programs to deliver improvements on the ground in terms of water security is essential. It is actually a prerequisite before a country can, ask for more money and make good use of any additional source of finance. So I know it may be counterintuitive, but it's really a message I would like to convey strongly. And I hope it resonates with the understanding of the audience.
Thank you. Tom, do you have any your final comment or feedback to audience and also others?
Well, I think there are many different dimensions, as we've seen, 5 that we've defined for AWDO to water security plus finance and governance are 2 of many cross-cutting themes. And somewhat on the same notion of what Xavier said is it can all seem a bit daunting and overwhelming, and where do I start? But I think it starts by focusing on what you can control and what's achievable with what you have right now. And that may be governance, improving not just working with the finance on how you do things, but making better decisions on over assets, on how you plan your cities, how you plan your rural development, and how you look at your economic growth going forward. All of these things don't cost money, but require an investment and thinking about how you go about engaging the future in the most robust way to ensure you are water secure. And I'd say the other important element about this is it's not just about quantity and quality, but also about equity and inclusiveness for all the people involved, since we're all stakeholders and benefit or lose from water security.
Thank you. Now, Ravi, I would like to ask you your wrap-up of today's webinar.
Well, thank you very much, Yumiko. It's such a rich presentation. It's difficult to summarize all the points because there are so many of them. What I can say is that with such an incisive analysis and robust presentation of recommendations, one naturally asks, well, where do we go from here? But as far as this region is concerned, the Asia-Pacific region, these recommendations are sure to figure in the political declaration that is going to be issued at Kumamoto at the next Asia-Pacific Water Summit in April 2022. And that will provide, hopefully, an impetus and momentum for some of these actions to actually take shape on the ground. So with that, I'd like to thank both Tom and Xavier for their presentations and their analysis and their thoughtful responses to the questions. Many more questions will be asked, And please don't hesitate to write to Yumiko with them, and then they will be answered in due course. So with that, may I wish you all a good 2022. Hope it's better than 2021. Hope it's better than 2020. And I hope you will join me in thanking both Tom and Xavier for the excellent presentations. And thank you all very much for your participation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi, for coordinating this webinar and facilitating the question between audience and the panelists. And also thank you for Dr. Tom Panella and also Dr. Xavier for making very concise presentation within very short time. And I also thank you so much for your responding to all questions from audience and also from Ravi. So now I would like to close to today's webinar, but I would like to introduce next webinar. Next webinar currently is planning to organize in 21st January. The topic will be water governance in Asia and the Pacific, which will be particularly focused on the governance parts of the Asian Pacific Water Development Outlook 2020. So there's some discussion in governance parts will be also related to today's discussion about the finance in Asian Pacific. So it will be very helpful if you can continuously joining this webinar, then have a discussion with us. Thank you so much for your cooperation. And the URL will be sent to you in early January. So please make sure about our email from us. And also the information of webinar, as well as today's presentation document, and also the recording will be available from the APWF homepage. And if you have any question, comment, feedback, please contact APWF Secretariat through sending this email address. Thank you so much. And Tom and Xavier, it will be very, very helpful and grateful if you can continuously cooperate with us for next webinar, as well as our future discussion towards the fourth APWS and also towards the water security in Asia Pacific. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Namiko.
And I also thank you to all audience to listening to today's webinar. And I hope please stay healthy and have very festive season. Thank you so much for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
We'll be in touch.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Happy festive season to you.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so
Happy New
much.
Year. Thank you.